If you are someone who owns animals or is looking to get their first pet, you've probably come across videos and lists titled, best beginner pets, best beginner reptiles, whatever it is. Now, despite all of these lists and videos out there that exist telling you what animals make good beginner pets, in my experience owning and working with animals, I've come to realize that a lot of beginner animals aren't necessarily what I would consider a good beginner pet. So today we are going to be talking about 5 common beginner animals that I personally wouldn't recommend to beginners. So before we get into the actual list of animals that I don't feel make the best beginner pets, let's talk about what a beginner pet actually is. Now, I'm sure it seems pretty straightforward to most. A beginner pet is a pet that a beginner is probably going to have a relatively easy time taking care of. When we own animals in captivity, there are hundreds and thousands of different species out there that all have their own unique care requirements, and some of them are a lot better suited to beginners than others. Some of these animals are best left to very experienced keepers. So when I am thinking of a beginner pet, I am looking for a few things. The first thing being is just ease of care. If I'm looking for an animal that I want to recommend to a beginner, I'm going to look for something that has relatively easy and straightforward care. I'm also going to be looking for an animal that is relatively hardy and may be able to tolerate a few beginner mistakes, because there are animals out there that are very sensitive and need really perfect conditions, but there are some animals out there that are a lot hardier than others and can tolerate a wider range of conditions. Another thing I'm looking for in a good beginner pet is accessibility. So this basically just means how easy is the animal to get. If someone is looking for their first time animal, you don't want to recommend something to them that is going to take them years to find or is just going to have, a really hard time coming across. You want to recommend an animal that ideally your average person is going to be able to find relatively easily. And the last thing I look for when recommending some sort of beginner or first time animal is a support network. And now I don't mean, your family and friends all need to be incredibly supportive of your new animal that you're getting. I mean, there needs to be a community of people out there who are experienced with this animal that, can share and give their advice. So basically, I'm looking for an animal, that a lot of people already have experience with and knowledge on. So these are the things that I'm looking for when it comes to a beginner animal. I'm looking for an animal with relatively easy care. I'm looking for an animal that is somewhat hardy. I'm looking for an animal that tends to be accessible to most people. And I'm also looking for an animal that has a strong community built around it. I would also like to give a quick little disclaimer that, just because I'm saying these aren't great beginner pets doesn't mean you can't get this animal as your first pet. If this is an animal that you really want and you want it to be your first pet, I think that is still entirely fine. Just know, you should do a little extra research on it and just make sure you're prepared. I'm not saying that these are bad pets. I'm just saying, their care is often a little bit more complicated than people tend to think it is. So this here is Lex, and Lex is my bearded dragon. Bearded dragons are an animal that is very often recommended to first-time pet keepers or first-time reptile owners as a good beginner lizard. And while I absolutely love bearded dragons and think that they do make great pets, I don't necessarily think they make the best pets for beginners. The main reason why I don't think bearded dragons make the best beginner pet is because their care is a lot more complex than a lot of other lizards. So bearded dragons are actually a relatively accessible and hardy species of lizard to keep. If you walk into any pet store, you're going to see bearded dragons. Not that I recommend buying them from a pet store, but I'm just saying you can see them at any pet store. A lot of people keep them, so there is a big bearded dragon, community, and they are relatively hardy. The only reason I don't think bearded dragons make great beginner animals is because the level of care that they require. Bearded dragons require fairly large enclosures. They're not a super small lizard, so they do need a decent amount of room to move around in, and for that reason, I would not recommend keeping a bearded dragon in anything smaller than a 4x2x2 enclosure, which is what you see Lex in here. In my opinion, this is the minimum a bearded dragon should be kept in, which isn't always extremely easy for a beginner to get. You don't always want an enclosure this large. Now, maybe you do, but I'm just saying it is something to consider. Bearded dragons also require very specific lighting. Reptile lighting can be a bit complicated and therefore it can be a bit overwhelming for a beginner who has no experience with reptile lighting before. A bearded dragon is going to need both a heat lamp that achieves the proper basking temperatures as well as a T5 high output UVB bulb, which again, this is something else that people often have trouble with because there is many different types of UVB bulbs, but in my opinion, I would only recommend using a T5 high output for bearded dragons. Bearded dragons also have a more complicated diet than many other reptiles that you keep in captivity. Bearded dragons are omnivores, which means they eat both plant and insect matter. Bearded dragons also need specific supplements with their diet, so again, this is just a little bit more complicated than a lot of other reptiles out there. Bearded dragons are also a semi-arboreal species of lizard, so if you're setting up an enclosure for a bearded dragon, it's important to keep in mind that they need lots of room to climb as well as just space to explore and be able to hang out and do their thing. So I definitely don't think that bearded dragons are extremely difficult to care for by any means. I'm just saying that they might not be the easiest for a beginner as they do have some complicated aspects to their care, such as their lighting requirements, their enclosure size requirements, their diet requirements, and those things can be a little bit overwhelming to someone who doesn't have any reptile experience. So again, a bearded dragon isn't the worst beginner pet out there. Like I said, they are fairly hardy, they're accessible, there's a good community out there, and they're not the hardest to care for, but I do think that there are some better beginner options such as a crested gecko or a leopard gecko. And now the next animal that I want to talk about is goldfish. I'm sure everyone here knows what a goldfish is. I feel like a goldfish is one of those standard, like, oh, you want a pet? That's easy, go get a goldfish. But unfortunately, it is not that simple. Now, despite, you know, just the misconception out there that goldfish can just live in a bowl and, you know, you feed them, change their water every now and then, there are a lot more work than that. Goldfish actually need very large tanks, so goldfish grow very large. It is definitely a myth that fish only grow to the size of their tank. If their growth is stunted due to a small enclosure, it's going to shorten the animal's lifespan. Typically, it is recommended to not keep goldfish in anything less than a 40-gallon aquarium. So unless you're willing to dedicate that space to a 40-gallon tank, I wouldn't recommend getting goldfish. Goldfish are also very messy. Goldfish poop and eat a lot. So because of that, goldfish need a lot of water maintenance. On your tank, you're going to want to have very strong filtration, which can be expensive. You know, you can't just throw like a 10-gallon filter on your goldfish tank. When I kept goldfish, I was using over 100 gallons of filtration on like a 40-gallon aquarium. So yeah, when it comes to goldfish, I would really recommend going overboard because they are very messy. But because they're messy, like I said, you need to do a decent amount of aquarium maintenance, such as water changes. So, you know, goldfish really are not just as simple as putting a goldfish in a bowl and letting it live on your nightstand. You really need to be able to dedicate the space to a 40-gallon breeder aquarium, and you need to make sure you're willing to do weekly water maintenance for these fish. Goldfish are also quite social, so because of that, I would never recommend keeping a goldfish alone. I would always recommend having at least 2, if not more of them. So while I don't think goldfish are necessarily that difficult to take care of by any means, they just need a lot more space and time than people think they do. So if you are wanting goldfish, just, you know, make sure you're wanting it because you actually want a nice aquarium that you are willing to do maintenance on, and not just a tiny bowl that is going to sit next to your bed and do nothing but get dirty and gross and have a sad fish in it. Similar to bearded dragons, goldfish are relatively hardy, they are easy to find, and there is a large group of goldfish keepers out there, so you know, they definitely have some beginner perks to them, but due to their size and their messiness, I don't personally think they make the best beginner fish out there. Ball pythons are a species of snake that is super often recommended to first-time snake owners, and honestly I feel like this is maybe the one that I disagree with the most out of this whole list of animals, I feel like out of all of the animals I'm talking about today, ball pythons might just be the worst beginner animal, and I actually did a whole video just about ball pythons. If you want to check that out, I'll link it up here. Ball pythons tend to be very common beginner snakes, one, because they are hardy. Like I said, that is a good beginner quality. They're also very accessible, especially right now. The ball python market is just huge. You definitely will not have a hard time trying to find a ball python if this is the animal that you are looking for. There's also a ton of people out there who keep and work with ball pythons, so because of that, there is a pretty good support network out there. However, there are quite a few reasons why I don't think ball pythons make good beginner pets in the slightest. So ball pythons can be very, very, very picky snakes, and this can be very scary and challenging to a first-time owner. And I'm speaking from experience because my first snake ever was a ball python, and I ended up a little bit overwhelmed and stressed out. Ball pythons have pretty specific humidity requirements. If their humidity is not correct, it can lead to issues like respiratory infections and bad sheds. So this is an issue that people run into all the time, is not being able to successfully meet the humidity requirements for a ball python. Ball pythons can also just be very picky about eating and their overall enclosure. So ball pythons are pretty picky about their habitat, and if they don't feel safe and secure in their habitat, they might not eat. Ball pythons are notorious for refusing food if even just the slightest thing is off in their enclosure. So because of this, it can be really overwhelming to new time owners who have just gotten their first snake and are now having all of these issues trying to get it to eat, and on top of that, maybe having issues with it having bad sheds. And yeah, ball pythons overall are just not super forgiving. I guess, you know, ball pythons are hardy. You know, too much humidity or too little humidity is not going to just immediately kill your ball python, but it is going to lead to issues, like I said, stuck shed. So while you could technically say that ball pythons are hardy, they're just not very forgiving at all. Ball pythons, like bearded dragons, also get quite large. You know, Angel here is a sub-adult, so she will get bigger than this. And you know, compared to something like a Burmese python or an anaconda or a reticulated python, a ball python isn't that big, but they are big enough that they're going to need an enclosure like a bearded dragon that is at least 4 by 2 by 2. In my opinion, that is a good minimum size for an adult ball python. As I mentioned earlier, a ball python was my first snake ever, and I did have issues with it. So my very first snake ever was Titan. He was an adult ball python when I got him. It took me like 6 weeks to get him to eat, and I was super stressed out that whole time because he wouldn't eat anything, and I was getting worried. You know, I was a first-time snake owner. I didn't want to have to deal with this. It was very stressful, and he also had bad sheds. He had shedding issues. Even though I thought that I was doing a good job in maintaining his humidity, he still had a terrible shed the first time I owned him, and I just felt very overwhelmed and stressed out. Then for my second snake, I got a corn snake, and compared to my ball python, she was just the easiest animal I have ever cared for in my entire life. So again, I don't think ball pythons are necessarily difficult to care for, but there are just many easier options out there that I think are way better suited to beginners than ball pythons are. If you are someone who is looking for your first snake, I would probably recommend, like I said, a corn snake or a king snake or a milk snake over a ball python. Even like a Kenyan sand boa I would recommend over a ball python. There are honestly a lot of snakes that I would recommend over a ball python for a first-time snake owner. So while a ball python is accessible, while there is a decent community for them, they are somewhat hardy, but they're not very forgiving, and their care is a bit more challenging than a lot of other snakes and a lot of people assume it is. So if you're someone who has looked into pet amphibians before, you may have heard of something called a pacman frog. Pacman frogs are a species of frog that are incredibly common in the pet trade and are very often recommended to beginner keepers. Now, despite pacman frogs very often being recommended to beginners, there is one thing in my mind that prevents me from really wanting to recommend a pacman frog to anyone ever, and that is just the fact that they die very often in captivity. Pacman frogs do not just seem to live full lives when kept in captivity, and I don't know why. I know so many people who have kept Pacman frogs, myself included, and out of everyone I know who has kept Pacman frogs, I know way more people who have had their frogs suddenly and randomly die than those who have been able to successfully keep their frogs for an extended period of time. And the thing is, I have no idea why this is, but they just do not seem to do well. You know, I have no idea if this is due to poor genetics and poor breeding, or if it is due to improper care and we just don't know, maybe we're missing something. But that is the thing. This is why I don't recommend this animal to beginners, is they seem to die in captivity very often and we don't know why. So why do we keep suggesting these animals for people to keep who have very little experience keeping animals? Pacman frog care is typically always presented as pretty just easy, simple, straightforward. So when you're reading about Pacman frogs and their care, they do seem like a really good beginner pet, and you know, from what we know of them right now, yes, their care does seem pretty beginner friendly. However, whatever we're doing for some reason does not seem to be working, because so many of these frogs are not living full lives. So because of that, I personally decided I will not own a Pacman frog again, at least until we know more about them and have a better understanding of, you know, why so many seem to pass away and how we can more successfully keep them in captivity. So because of that, I just would not at all recommend them to be a beginner. You know, not only for the animal's sake, because like I said, it does seem like a lot of Pacman frogs in captivity pass away suddenly for no apparent reason. So obviously that is not good for the frog, but it is also not good for the owner. If you are a first-time pet owner and you get a frog and your frog suddenly passes away for no apparent reason, that is not good for you. You know, it is not a good thing for you to have to experience that as a first-time owner. You know, an event like that happening is the type of thing that can prevent people from wanting to own animals again, and just, you know, it can be really heartbreaking, especially to a new owner who doesn't really understand. So because of that, I really just do not think that Pacman frogs make good pets for beginners. I think that there are a lot of other frogs out there that we are having more success with keeping. My chubby frog, for example, very similar to a Pacman frog, but chubby frogs seem to do way better in captivity. So yeah, I don't know, just again, I don't really know why Pacman frogs seem to not do well, so I can't really give any like insight on that. All I can say is I've seen a lot of cases of Pacman frogs not doing well, so because of that, I do not recommend them to beginners. And the last animal that I wanted to talk about is rabbit. Rabbits are often purchased for kids because they're cute, they're fluffy, you know, people love bunnies. Rabbits though have a lot more that goes into their care than people think. You know, you cannot just keep a rabbit in a cage in your bedroom and expect it to live a good, happy, healthy life. Rabbits need a lot of space, they need space to play and exercise, and something that very often gets ignored when people buy rabbits without doing research is the fact that they are social animals. So if you are considering getting a rabbit, you should actually be considering getting 2 rabbits. Rabbits are very, very, very high maintenance, and they require a lot of food, a lot of cleaning, and just daily work. If you were to ask me, I would say my rabbits are more work than probably my dog and cat are. Rabbits poop like 200 times a day. Keep that in mind. So think about all of the cleaning and litter changes you have to do. Rabbits are also very intelligent animals, and because of this, they can get bored easily. So, you know, this is why you can't just keep a rabbit in a small cage. They need to have a large area where they can walk and hop around and they can play with toys. They need enrichment. Enrichment is super important for them because, like I said, they are intelligent and they need this stimulation for their brains. Rabbits also have a pretty specific diet. The majority of their diet should be hay, but then they also need a lot of fresh vegetables and stuff in their diet. So, you know, it's not as easy as just feeding them a scoop of store-bought food. You actually do have to be giving them fresh food basically daily. So they are a lot more work than people assume. Rabbits can also live for around 10 years, so it is quite a long commitment if you are planning on getting a rabbit. Like I said too, rabbits are very often purchased for children, but if you ask me, rabbits really do not make great pets for kids and are probably better off for people like teenagers and adults who are looking for some sort of companion animal and they're, you know, willing to put in the time and effort that it takes to care for them. Rabbits are very fragile and children don't always know how to handle them properly. Rabbits can also give a nasty, nasty bite. If you're to get bit by a rabbit, it is way worse than being bit by a snake. I will say that. People always think that snake bites are bad. Like, I can guarantee you any rodent bite is 1,000 times worse than a snake bite. Yeah, rodent bites are not that fun. So while rabbits are great animals, they are very high maintenance and they have very specific care requirements. They need a lot of time and a lot of space, and they do cost quite a lot of money. You know, rabbits themselves are not very expensive. You can normally find them very, very cheap, but feeding rabbits and, you know, just the cost of their litter and toys and everything really adds up, and it is quite expensive. So there we go. There is my list of beginner animals that I don't personally recommend for beginners. I know I said this before, but I do just want to reiterate it that I am not saying that a beginner can't or shouldn't own these animals. You know, if you are watching this and you are the beginner I'm talking about, you know, if you are the person out there researching to get an animal and maybe you really want a bearded dragon, I am not here telling you that you cannot get a bearded dragon. All I'm saying is they are slightly more complicated than I think they are very often represented, and it's important to just make sure you're doing lots of research. So again, if you want any of these animals I talked about, or you know, any animal for that matter, just make sure you are doing a lot of research from multiple different sources so that you can get the best information possible and, you know, then care for your animal to the best of your abilities. Now that all of that is said, I am just going to go ahead and end the video here. If you are not subscribed to my channel, please make sure you do that. I would love to have you here and you don't want to miss out on more future videos, so please go and do that. It would mean a lot to me. Also be sure to give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to check out all of my social media. All of my social media will just be down in the description below, but for the most part it is all just EmmaSam99, so please go and follow me over there. I'd love to have you. With all that said, I'm gonna go ahead and end the video now. So thank you all so much for watching. I do really hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you all in my next video.